Hello, in this video, I'm going to explain to you what I ask my patients and what I tell my patients about CBD and THC use. Stay tuned. Hello, and welcome to Wellness with John. I'm John Peters, a therapist who's been in practice for over 25 years. And in this video, I want to talk a little bit about what I ask patients about in terms of CBD use and THC use, why I ask what I ask, and what I tell patients. But a couple of disclaimers first. Number one, I am a therapist. I'm not a prescriber. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a nutritionist. I'm not a naturopath. So I don't actually give people advice about how to manage their supplements or their medications in terms of advice about what they should take and how they should manage the dosing. But we therapists do consider supplements and medications in the context of the services that we deliver because supplements and medications are adjuncts to therapy. Therapy is an adjunct to good medical management for a lot of the types of things that we treat. And there's some particular issues that are with the use of CBD and THC that are very highly relevant to good evaluation and treatment for the types of things that we see. And it's also true, of course, that people use CBD and THC for a wide range of things beyond the scope of what mental health treatment tends to address. Okay. But so one disclaimer is I'm not a prescriber, I'm not a doctor, and this video should not be taken as medical advice about you should take this or that product. I also don't have any stock in any marijuana companies. And I'm also not, this is not a polemic for justifying me using marijuana, which that exists out there, but this is really me just talking about how I interact with my patients about it. The other thing is that, I'm not going to talk about the social and political context today in this video, but I also have to acknowledge that a discussion of CBD and THC use with therapy patients to be comprehensive really would have to consider the context because in the United States, from the very beginning of laws that regulated THC and marijuana, they were discriminatory and racist. And from a harm reduction standpoint, the the laws criminalizing marijuana historically have caused a tremendous amount of harm. So I'll leave it to you at this point. I may make a video on that topic later, but you can do your research and look at the history of marijuana laws and the consequences. It's cost Americans billions of dollars. It's jailed a lot of people, in my opinion, unnecessarily. And that prohibition continues today. And I'll come back around to how that's relevant to the problems that we face today in terms of fully understanding the role that CBD and THC can play in mental health treatment, because prohibition continues at the federal level and at the states level, even though the trend is toward decriminalization, right? So you don't have to be a libertarian to look at what has been happening, what is happening, what should happen, and know that our current situation is really not good for anyone, really, except the people who are making a lot of money about keeping prohibition strong. But I'll come back to that potentially in a later video. But let me just say that when we therapists do our initial evaluation of a new patient, we ask a wide range of questions, including substance use of any type, and including supplements and medications, of course, because we want to understand, like, what are people using to support their wellness plan? What types of medical treatment have they gotten? What types of trials in the past have they done that they're not doing now, and why? And CBD became popular a few years ago, and so there's kind of a new angle of thinking about this because more people, I think, are considering experimenting with CBD and some of the THC products. And so So I'm going to give you my 2 cents worth as a therapist and the things that I think about and the things that I tell my patients in terms of how they can be well-informed consumers if they're going to consider using CBD products and THC products. So if you're completely new to this, the reason I'm talking about CBD and THC is that CBD is a derivative of the hemp plant and the marijuana plant, and it does not get you high. And so one of the reasons that people sometimes choose to experiment with CBD products for anxiety, for sleep issues, for chronic pain issues is that understandably, a lot of people just don't want to be high. They don't want the side effect of the alteration of their state of mind, but they want to see if they can get some sort of benefit. And there's also been, of course, some significant focus in the last few years on the use of THC products and the use of CBD products for seizure disorders with good success as well. So, so you've got, I think, a burgeoning amount of the population who's interested in exploring these products. Okay. One problem, and with the research, and I mentioned a minute ago that the prohibition is a problem. One problem we face now is a lack of the breadth and depth of scientific knowledge about CBD and THC, partly because of the federal prohibition on research of marijuana because of its scheduling at the federal level and in the states, in a lot of states. So drugs of all sorts are on a multi-part schedule at the federal level, and then each state has their own scheduling scheme, which doesn't necessarily line up perfectly with the federal level. But historically, marijuana and THC has been labeled a Schedule 1 drug at the federal level, which means that it has no medical use, which is absurd given the history of the use of the plant and the compounds from the plant, and given the current state of the research. It's absolutely absurd that it remains a Schedule 1 drug. Now, again, is that an argument for pure laissez-faire, absolute decriminalization? Not necessarily, but the restrictions are so restrictive. This is the point. The restrictions are so restrictive that it is limiting our knowledge because it's slowed the ability of researchers to actually get up to speed to understand the role that CBD products and THC products can play in medical health. Okay. But so CBD is a compound that doesn't get you high, but it's closely chemically related to THC. The compound in marijuana that gets you high is THC delta 9, but there are other derivatives too, and you will see this on the market as well. If you go Google this and look at available legal products in your jurisdiction, and that there are delta 9 products, there are delta 8 products, and there are delta 10 products. You also, with this most recent federal farm bill, have this loophole that's causing, even in states, like I operate in Indiana, where THC products are fairly tightly restricted, but because of the farm bill, products that have very small amounts as a ratio to the mass of the product are allowed to be sold with THC delta 9, delta 8, and delta 10, and not just CBD. So basically, the so what of that is wherever you live, even in a state like Indiana that's fairly restrictive, there are really only like 3 states that are even more restrictive. But even where it's fairly restricted, you can obtain CBD products and THC products. But I'll say that part of my interest in this is that in my overall career, because of the pervasiveness of personal marijuana use, I have had the opportunity to talk to quite a large number of people who report on their use in the context of how I am evaluating and treating their mental health issues, including anxiety and depression. And I've heard reports from many patients about how they use marijuana in terms of treating things like seizure disorders and chronic pain, okay? So what I have observed non-scientifically, just from the large number of people that use marijuana products is that many of them actually do report positive relief of anxiety symptoms, improvement in sleep quality, and reduction of chronic pain. So that's anecdotal evidence, just the stories that people are telling me. But I will have to say that one aspect of that that is of particular concern to me, which is anxiety, has shown to me through the anecdotal reports from my patients that I would guesstimate around 50% of people who try using marijuana for anxiety actually get worse and not better. And I don't mean worse as in they injure themselves and then they're permanently more anxious having done THC. I just mean that when they use the THC product, that they're worse, they're more anxious, right? And so they easily and quickly learn I can't use those because it makes me anxious. Now, I do think this is one factor of this is that marijuana products basically, if you go Google this and look at what's available, often they are strain specific, especially if you're buying like marijuana flowers and smoking them. But even a lot of the products are strain specific, and there are types of strains, including indica and sativa, and then there are hybrids that are a combination of both. But sativa is more the mind high that you get from sativa strains, and indica is like the body high, where you don't get as much of the trippy mind effects. It is my understanding, just based on the broad amount of anecdotal reports that I've gotten, and also the logic of that in terms of the mind high of the sativa, that people who are anxious who use sativa products are more likely to get more anxious. People who are anxious who successfully use THC to be less anxious, I think most of them are using indica products because they don't have that trippiness of the mind high when there is a high as a component of the use, right? Um, but to be a well-informed consumer, I do think that you need to do your research and look at the continued additions of in the scientific literature of what's being said about the efficacy and the safety of CBD and THC. But but I think you're going to find that you're limited in getting good information. You might have a doctor who's open to talking about the use of these products, who has some experience with their patients, who can give you their 2 cents worth on whether it's reasonable or not. Some doctors are completely, poo-pooing it just because we don't have enough well-established, good quality empirical studies yet. But there are doctors out there who are supportive. But the one problem is, and you'll find this out if you talk to doctors and if you look at the research, consumers don't know what dosing to use for any particular type of product. So this is a barrier to being able to be assured that you're going to get a certain type of therapeutic result from use of a product, because we don't know what the dose is. So you're kind of on your own if you're going to experiment with these products to figure out, okay, which one am I taking, what kind, what dosing do I do in order to try to get the effect. You just basically, people have to experiment on their own in order to figure out whether it's at the right dose. Another barrier to this, of course, is that these products are not cheap. So at the typical dosing range that people are using them, probably people are spending $100 to $200 per month for these products. Maybe some people are getting away cheaper than that. But it can be prohibitively expensive to experiment with these products as well. Now, the other thing about THC, back to the different types of THC, when you look at the products, there's Delta 9, there's Delta 8, there's Delta 10, there's even Delta 11 and other forms. But in the anecdotal evidence I've gotten and the research I've done on people reporting using these products, because they're now more widely available, it has seemed to me, and this is just my report based on what I'm seeing with people reporting to me as patients and what I survey in the literature. So again, this is not a definitive kind of advice, but a lot of people report more negative effects from the Delta 8 and Delta 10 products compared to the Delta 9. So there's something about the concentration of just the Delta 10 or the Delta 8 that a lot of people find unpleasant when they do them compared with the Delta 9. But again, do your research if you're going to choose a product, because you can see what people are claiming are in the products in terms of the relative percentages of CBD and the THC with the different Delta 8, 9, and 10 types of THC. But another problem you run into is that if you're going to try to use a particular product, the industry, and this is again a byproduct of the prohibition, because the government's not actively regulating these products because they're Schedule 1, so they're not supposed to be used at all, basically. So therefore, the government can't formally, positively say, okay, now we're going to regulate them like supplements, other supplements. And so the lack of regulation means the lack of assuredness that the product you're getting actually has what it says it has in it. Some companies give reports from independent labs that do assessments of their product to try to validate their claims of what they're putting in the product. But I have seen plenty of reports in the discussion of this aspect of the topic that say that some of the companies out there are faking those reports, because you can just create a fake document, looks like a report from a lab, that says it whatever you want it to say. And so do you even know that the lab report is actually valid, validating the product that you want to be valid? And this is something that I think we need to solve through changing the states and the federal government's laws concerning the products so that they can be better regulated. Because as you might know, back in the 90s, the United States government started a little more actively regulating other types of supplements, and therefore consumers in the United States had a little more assuredness that what they were buying was what they were buying, and that there was, it's not the same as straight ahead pharmacology in terms of the prescriptions that you get from the pharmacy, in terms of that level of regulation for efficacy and safety through the FDA. But there is some oversight at the federal level now for supplements to help you trust them a little more, right? Other countries do this better. If you look at supplements from Germany or Japan, those are regulated in those countries the same way that our FDA regulates pharmaceuticals from the pharmacy. And so you're even more assured in places like that that have closer government regulation on efficacy and safety and quality. But that's a topic for another video as well. But basically, at this point, it's still a little bit of the Wild West, and you're on your own to try to figure out if you're going to experiment with the products. Can you find sources that you can trust so that you even know that you're taking what you think you're taking? Okay. But I want to say a couple more things about the use of the products as it pertains to mental health. One issue that I've encountered throughout my career from the very beginning in talking with patients about use of THC products is its impact on emotional regulation. And I think that it became prominent to me probably first when I was just getting better at assessing people, both in terms of how they were presenting in front of me, but how they kind of looked developmentally given their reported and apparent history, and also how they function through time when I work with them. And the short of it is, what I observed was that there are a lot of people who are what I would call chronic THC users, who use more days than not, if not daily, and start that relatively early in life and tend to use that way throughout their life. And I certainly know that a lot of people use THC when going through stressful times or in general for emotional regulation, because it blunts the emotional feelings. And for a lot of people think, well, that's a way to make them more manageable. But one of the biggest risks from a mental health standpoint that I have seen with the long-term use of THC is that if someone is basically too high too much of the time, then they blunt not only their individual moments of feelings, maybe making them more manageable, but they blunt their overall emotional development. Because you're not going to emotionally mature as fast if you're basically fogging yourself out so that you aren't actually feeling your feelings. Part of how we become more emotionally mature is that we feel what we feel, and then we learn how to competently feel what we feel and competently respond to those feelings. Okay. So it's easy to see the logic of why any drug that you're taking in that's going to blunt that is going to diminish the raw feelings, but that potentially is going to thwart development. And in practical terms, this is why sometimes I see someone who's like 35 or 40 years old, and emotionally their maturity kind of looks more like a teenager. Why is that? Because they started smoking pot as a teenager and they smoked daily throughout their life. So they're basically too stoned to fully participate in their emotional life. Therefore, they were robbed of some emotional development. And this shows up in their interpersonal complications. This shows up in partners being dissatisfied with them as people who are not as emotionally mature as the partner might expect them to be. Excuse me. And I think that for the chronic users too, at least for a subset, this can become an issue in terms of emotional dysregulation if they discontinue the use. So sometimes people stop because their partner demands it or because of a job or something. And not everybody is addicted to marijuana, even chronic users. The addiction mechanism is clearly different than it is for a lot of other drugs. And so with most people, even people who've used daily for a long time, when they stop, they don't really have a lot of significant negative effects that suggest the mechanism for dependence. But a lot of people will have short-term, for a few days, sleep disturbance and a little bit of emotional lability. But there is a subset of people, and again, because of the dearth of the research, for the reasons I stated earlier, we don't have the best explanation of this, but it seems from what I've read over the years that somewhere between 5 and 15% of chronic marijuana users have a type of dependence that means that when they discontinue use, they're significantly more emotionally labile and or irritable. And so, that's just one indication that there's probably some type of psychological and or physical dependence that affects the brain from chronic use. So the jury's still out on that because we just still don't have great research on that. But the majority of people who even use chronically can discontinue use with no real ill effects, it seems. But there's a subset that seem to become more dependent on use and have more presentation of emotional dysregulation when they discontinue the use. So one risk of long-term use is emotional blunting and thwarting emotional development. It also has costs in terms of interpersonal functioning because a common complaint of partners of people who chronically use daily is that basically they're dating a zombie, that the person is just too stoned to fully participate in the types of closeness and relationship so that there can be mutually satisfying intimacy. So long-term marijuana use can be a threat to intimacy, in these ways, because I think mainly because of the emotional blunting that happens there as well. So this is one reason that I'm not, a proponent of saying, it's benign. Let's just all smoke marijuana and we'll be better off. I do think it has legitimate uses for a lot of people. I think that we're going to learn more about that as prohibition is reversed. And I think compared to other types of drugs that we're concerned about when we talk about, broad drug use, it causes much less harm and is safer. But because of all of that, that doesn't necessarily mean that we just wholesale accept that, okay, well then it's totally benign, because it's not totally benign. It can affect the quality of your relationships. It can affect your emotional development. And it does, when you're too high to drive, you shouldn't be operating a heavy machine. And I think legitimately some workplaces have a legitimate concern about safety, so that they don't want their employees to be high at work. Although I think that drug testing for THC because of prohibition is far too wide. And there are a lot of employers who just shouldn't be testing. That's my personal opinion, because it doesn't, people aren't showing up to work high. and yet they're failing their drug test because THC is something that's fat soluble, so it sticks around in your body for a long time after you use, even when you're not high, and therefore you can fail the drug test. The last thing I want to say about the topic is one thing that's become more popular in the last few years is microdosing, which means taking very small doses of some whatever it is. In this case, we're talking about CBD and THC. Obviously, when people take a big dose of a THC product, they're typically doing that to get high. If they take a big dose of CBD, it's just, again, because we don't know what the right dosing is. But there are lots of people who are doing really small doses, and even the doses of the THC Delta 9 products at microdoses don't typically get people high. And so that means that some people are reporting anecdotally benefits in terms of sleep improvement, anxiety reduction, and reduction of chronic pain. And they're not having the negative effects of the alteration of their mentation that you get with the higher doses. But again, what is the right microdose for that? We don't know yet. And I'll leave it to you to Google that. There's actually plenty of discussion. If you go Google that or you look up discussion of microdosing CBD and THC on here on YouTube, you'll find that there's quite a bit of discussion about that. The problem is that we just don't have that validated by a lot of empirical studies because of the limitation on via prohibition that continues to this day, and that I think ought to change actually so that we can know more about it. But anyway, that's my 2 cents worth. When I evaluate a new patient, I always ask about supplements. I always ask about drug use. I don't take the position that all drug use is bad, because the reality is some people use drugs responsibly and consistent with their personal goals and in ways that mitigate risks and harms. So, and I think that is simply often true with THC products, that there are a lot of people who are using it in a way that doesn't negatively impact their life. Obviously, if they're using it in a state in a way that's currently illegal, they're taking a legal risk. So there's that. But the reality is a lot of people are getting a lot of good benefit. I think it's worth continuing to research as a society, and you as a consumer might consider researching it on your own and discussing it with your medical provider if you think that you want to experiment with adding it to your wellness regimen. So that's my 2 cents worth on that. So if you like this kind of content, definitely hit the like button below. If you have yet to subscribe, please subscribe. And please leave a comment if you have something interesting you'd like to share or ask, because comments help me tailor the kind of videos that I make for this channel. And I will see you in an upcoming video. Thanks.